Darryll, Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your might. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart, and you shall impress them upon your children. And you shall speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Hallelujah. Shabbat shalom, everyone, and greetings to the people in the outreach ministry. I don't know who that is out there that's the outreach minister. Well, have you gotten way past the notion that keeping Torah, quote unquote, is in any way earning salvation? You know, I know a lot of you heard the word Torah. It simply means law. Laws, regulations, instructions, that are kind of minutiae of what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. To most people, that's what Torah is. And if you keep Torah, you are just plain legalistic. To Christians, when they label us as Torah keepers, they think of us as legalistic, don't they? So what comes to your mind when you hear the word law? Or when you hear the word Torah? Some would say some part of the 613 laws. Torah is commonly a reference to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scripture. But most people, when they hear the word Torah, they don't think of it, especially believers. We don't think of the first 5 books for the most part. We think of the minutia, of the details, of the instruction and the regulations and what you can do and what you can't do. And that's why so often when we're going through the Torah, we want to know, well, how does that apply? How does that apply to today? How do we engage that piece of the minutia of the laws and the regulations today? That's what our thinking goes to, because we are still Western thinking. Where is the law? The law. Where is the law in Genesis? And yet Genesis is the first book of the Torah. Where is the law? What chapter in Genesis gives us laws, regulations, minutia, details about doing and don'ting? I'll invent a word. What we can do and what we can't do. Torah, the Hebrew word, would be better rendered teaching. The teaching. Is there teaching in Genesis? If you were, imagine this now, if you were an infinite being, what we would call a mighty one, and of course, most people today think of a 3-letter word when they think of the mighty one, but hopefully you don't, and hopefully you're not mixing leaven in with the truth. And a lot of people that some of us have said are Torah keepers are really not Torah keepers, because they mix and they're putting leavening in with truth. Undoubtedly they have some truth. Does the Catholic Church have some truth? Do the Lutherans and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians, do they have some truth? Sure they do. If they have this book in their lap somewhere, they've got some truth. But are they mixing leavening in it? And if they mix leavening, if you are mixing, if we're putting falsehood, if we're putting poison in with the food, are they truly keeping Torah? No matter how much truth they've got, if they're still mixing, they're not truly keeping Torah. Because what is one of the regulations, if you will, in Torah? Do not add to and do not take away from. Do not mix. And so if they are mixing, they may think they're keeping Torah, but they're not. And we may think of them as Torah keepers because they keep a body of it, because maybe they keep the Sabbath. Maybe they even keep the set-apart days. But if they don't even know what Torah is, and they're mixing, and they don't know that part of the Torah and the instruction of Yahweh is, don't let pagan names come out of your mouth in reference to me, and yet they do it, they are not keeping Torah. So if you were an infinite being, a mighty one, and you wanted to communicate with a much lesser or inferior being, which we are we not? How would you go about it? How would you go about introducing yourself to this lesser being? And that's what Genesis really is. It's the introduction from Yahweh to a lesser being. Would you translate yourself to his level? And the answer to that would probably be, yeah, that's probably what we'd have to do. Otherwise, how's he ever going to understand what kind of a relationship he's supposed to have with us? How is he going to be able to understand the words that he's speaking to us? So this basically is what Torah is. Torah is a translation to a lesser being from a much superior being in every way to this lesser being. Perhaps we should think of Torah in this way. Here are four things to think about with regard to Torah. It's Yahweh's introduction or self-disclaimer or self-disclosure. It is the essence of Yahweh's will and wisdom. It's his desire. And what did Yahshua say? Who are his brothers, his sisters, his mothers? Who are his nearest relatives? The one who are doing the desire of his Father. And that's what Torah is. Torah is an expression of the desire of the Father. It's Yahweh's word. We're going to look at that. I missed that in a part of this message, but it's going to be there because I'm going to put it back in there. Word. It's a very important. It's a very important concept. What is the word? What is the word? It's also the substance, and this is what most people really miss. It is the substance of his being and his character. I submit to you that no one who does not understand Genesis 1:26 can keep the Torah properly. And yet, where do you hear that? Where do you hear? I mean, I know that almost all of you will listen to, videos or watch videos on YouTube and maybe some tape messages and this, that. Where do you hear that from those people? They may have a lot of truth, and you may consider them Torah keepers. But if they don't understand Genesis 1:26, they cannot keep the Torah because they don't know what Torah is. Torah is the substance of Yahweh's being and his character, and it is, as Paul stated, it is the goal of humankind. I think that someday when you meet the Apostle Shaul and you ask him what was the essence, what's the purpose of man, I do believe Shaul will tell you it's Genesis 1:26. That we are to become Elohim. And what is Elohim? He's the Torah. How does Yahweh, it's also the revelation of the Mighty One, how does Yahweh convey the process of his dealings with man? How does Yahweh, where does that start? Where does Yahweh start conveying the process of his dealings with man? He tells stories. A language man can understand. How do you as a parent, or how did you, or how will you as a parent, how will you introduce your children to the custom and the being of humans in our world today? Now, I would say, if I'm not mistaken, every one of you began to communicate this essence of human being through stories. Now, not always did we use stories that were completely true and that should have conveyed the essence of man, but we did convey the essence of man and his society and our culture through stories, didn't we? Is there anybody here who never told stories to their kids? You probably didn't think of it that way, but that's what you were doing, and we all did it, didn't we? That's how Yahweh is doing it. He starts it out in Genesis. That's the beginning of the process, stories. And isn't that primarily what Genesis is? Genesis is not a list or a documentation that gives us rules and regulations, and yet Yahweh conveys, he must have conveyed some of those to some of those people, because it says that Abraham obeyed my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, didn't he? And yet, where do you find in Torah where there is a codification or a codification of Yahweh's regulations? Nowhere. Nowhere. In fact, we find some of those individuals doing things that are contrary to what Yahweh later gives to the Israelites in the Torah, don't we? Yahshua said from the beginning Yahweh intended there to be one man and one woman. And yet we have all kinds of those patriarchs that had multiple wives and concubines. And there are some people who will look at that and say, well, see, there's the law that Yahweh was given. It was okay. And he comes along later when he is telling them what the regulations are and says that wasn't so pretty okay. Okay? So we can't justify keeping Torah by looking at what some of the stories tell us about what people were doing in the book of Genesis. Genesis is stories, and it is the beginning of the process that tells us what kind of a relationship we're supposed to have with Yahweh. What does he tell us in those stories way back at the beginning? Well, first of all, he tells us that he chooses. He chooses. He calls. We have it in the story of Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1, we have a general creation. And by the way, it does say, and we're going to look at this again later, it doesn't say Ba-rashit, it says Bereshit. This is in the beginning, which is what most translations say, but the Hebrew word is not Ba-rashit, it's Bereshit. The difference between the beginning and a beginning. And it is, it's really strange that here is what all of the Hebrew translations have, and yet even the Hebrews themselves translate it as the. And it's not the, it doesn't say the. It's a beginning. And if you understand the difference between the and the beginning and a beginning, you can understand why science says that the earth is billions of years old. Because the beginning is not what's talked about in Genesis. It's a beginning. Okay? So we have this story of creation, followed by a special choosing of Abraham and Hawa. Now, some people think they were the first man and the first woman. But I don't think so. I think there was a creation of man in Genesis, the first chapter, and Genesis chapter 2 is the process where Yahweh is revealing that he chooses a special group of people to make a relationship with. A special dealing with Abel as opposed to Cain. You know, that's the story of Cain and Abel is a lot more than just Cain and Abel. It really tells us a lot, and it even goes to an explanation of what we were reading in Torah a week or two ago when we found out that Yahweh doesn't count or did not count or told the Hebrews don't count children under 1 month old. It goes back to this principle right here. Yahweh doesn't necessarily take the firstborn and call it the firstborn. He doesn't necessarily follow the favor of the firstborn The oldest, because he didn't do that with the sons of Jacob, did he? He didn't do that with the sons of Isaac. He didn't do that with the sons of Abraham. It's the same story. It's the same story. Yahweh is telling something about, revealing something about this relation, how he chooses. He chooses. You don't volunteer. Mama and daddy don't choose. Yahweh chooses. A special, chapter 4, that's chapter 4, a special calling of Noah in chapter 6. And Abraham and his descendants, chapter 12 and following. All the way through the book of Genesis, it's about a revelation how Yahweh chooses. You don't find any one of these people who volunteered and say, hey, pick me, pick me. Yahweh does the choosing. And it comes all the way down to us, doesn't it? None of you volunteered. We were all chosen. I'm the fifth born in my family. Some of you are firstborn, but I would probably guess that most of you are not firstborn. And yet you're the ones that Yahweh has called to be firstborn, where it really counts. How does Yahweh tell us what it looks like when he saves his people? He tells us that in the stories of Genesis. He tells us the story of Noah. What is the story of the flood? It's how Yahweh saves his people. Isaac. The story of Isaac is a story that tells us and reveals to us how Yahweh saves his people. He doesn't necessarily save the first one. He saves the one he chooses. And, how did he save him? He saved him from Abraham slicing his throat and offering him as a sacrifice. It's there. Joseph. Did Joseph need to be saved? Oh yeah, he did. He was sold into Egypt by his brothers. But Yahweh saved him out of it. That's how Yahweh saves his people. And then Israel coming under the Egyptians, and through Moses, Yahweh saves his people. It's how the whole book is about Yahweh saving his people, bringing his people back to him. You see how much we can limit ourselves and our understanding if we just think laws, rules, regulations when we think of Torah. Because Genesis is Torah, but Genesis is not about rules, regulations, and laws. Not at all about that. There are several English words that can and are translated from aspects of the Torah, resulting from several aspects represented by 7 perfect number, 7 Hebrew words. And actually, we could say +1 because I had left Devarim, out of that list, because here they are. The Torah, mitzvot, kuk or kukim, which is the plural, mishpat and mishpatim, edut, pekud, derek, and the 8th one would be devarim. And actually, devarim is probably the most common because it is used 1,438 times in the Old Testament. I've got the other words down here, and you can look at them, and you can see that none of them come close. There's 704, 219, 26 only. Let's see what else I've got here. 24, 181, 421. So the other 7 words, 400, little over 400 times is the most common. But word is 1,400, over 1,400 times. It's a very, very important word in the Hebrew language and in the scripture. Psalm 119, which we have been reading for 40, how many? 42 days today, right? For 42 days, we've been reading from Psalm 119. The very first section, the first 7 verses of Psalm 119 has all 7. That's probably why I said 7, because the 8th word is not there. But it is in Psalm 119. But the 7 words are in the first 7 verses of Psalm 119. And we're reading this because we believe that, that it does reflect the law, the Torah, the law portion of Torah with regard to the giving of the law on Mount Zion, on Shavuot. Let's read Psalm 119, verses 1 through 7. Aleph. And so one of the reasons we read it is because this is one of those poems in the Psalms that is divided into 22 sections and has a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in the first. And actually, it's not just by fiat that these are labeled this way. The first letter of every one of these verses is the letter, one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they're in order. They're in order, so figure out how that came to be. And so the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph, and it comprises a section, the first 7 verses of Psalm 119. Now it says blessed, and really the Hebrew word there is not Baruch, it's Ashrai, which means happy. So what it is really saying is that the result of what these verses is talking about is going to make someone complete. It's going to give them a euphoria. It's going to make them happy, if we want to use the English term here. It's not that if you do these things, Yahweh is going to supernaturally bless you. It's different than that. That's what Baruch is. Baruch is something that you do, and Yahweh actually puts a blessing on you. These are expressions of things that happen automatically, aside from whether someone believes or not. If they do these things, they're going to get some happiness. You know a lot of people that have some happiness because they keep parts of Torah. Okay, so it says, happy are the perfect in the way. So there's the first word, way, Darryll. And it's transliterated exactly the same way that my grandson spells his name, D-E-R-E-K, Darryll. And it is a word that is kind of broad. You see it down here. It's number 1870 in the Hebrew of Strong's. And you see all the ways that it can be translated. And one of the main things, the main ways this word is used is for a way or a path. And so it's broad. It's broad. So the Torah is, first of all, in these Psalms, described as a broad way. Broadway, we know what Broadway is. And it's not America's Broadway, because it's Yahweh's Broadway. It is the way that you go, which encompasses what Yahweh's purpose is for you. What the Torah really leads us to, the true Torah. Not the laws and the regulations, but the true Torah, which also is a very broad word, by the way, not specific. And we always want to look, when we think of Torah, when we think of Torah observers, we always want to go to the details. Okay, what are they doing? There's a different word for those details. Because Torah is a broad, it means instruction. But Darryll means the way, the path that it leads you into. And obviously, doesn't it make sense that if someone is walking in Yahweh's way, that they're going to have happiness and completeness and in their life, it makes sense. It makes sense. Blessed are the perfect in the way who walk in the Torah, and of course that's translated law, but it really means more broadly teaching. The whole teaching, which is what happens in the book of Genesis, where you don't find specifically laws, minutiae of laws being taught. It's given in a much broader sense because Yahweh is teaching it in stories. And what he is doing is he is trying to connect to a relationship. Now, you may say, well, this group or that group keeps the Torah. Well, they probably don't even really know what Torah is. Even if they know that the word Torah means instruction, they probably don't know what kind of instruction they're getting and the purpose of the instruction in the book of Genesis, which is the first of 5 books called the Torah. Interesting, isn't it? So the Torah is also like Darryll. It's a broad word, and it means teaching in general. Yahweh teaches us in many ways. Yahweh teaches us by giving us specific laws and regulations, but that's not all Torah is. Torah is much broader than that. Torah is the teaching that he gives us in the stories in the book of Genesis. Psalm 119, verse 2. Ashrai, again, it's the word Ashrai, are those who observe his witnesses. His witnesses. Well, what in the heck is a witness? It's usually somebody watching. That's when something happens. The most important place where witnesses is defined is in the manna that Aaron was instructed to take a sample of and put in the Ark of the Covenant. That was the first witness that was put in the Ark of the Covenant. And it was put there with another witness, which was the 2 tables of stone. It wasn't what was on the tables of stone so much. It wasn't necessarily the manna, but it was what Yahweh was doing with Israel by giving them manna. What Yahweh was doing with Israel by giving them his 10 commandments. Because that's all that was written on the 10 words. That's all that was written on the stone. It's what was Yahweh accomplishing. Those were witnesses. Witnesses that Yahweh was giving instruction, that Yahweh was causing a relationship. It was the witness of that attempt to make a relationship with Israel. And that's called edut, witnesses. Edut. So blessed are those, or happy are those who observe his witnesses, who understand what Yahweh was trying to tell them when he had them put the manna and the stones in the Ark of the Covenant. Ark of the Covenant. They were witnesses. You see a little bit of difference there it wasn't the manna, it was what the manna meant in the relationship. It wasn't the stones, it's what the stones had written on them that meant something to the relationship. It's what Yahweh is trying to tell them. Verse 3. Yes, and of course, I've got that word edut down here. And it's actually Lindell of what we usually think of as Torah. So that's orders. Verse 5. Oh, that my ways were established to guard your laws. The different Hebrew word kok or kokim. And down below you'll see that's Hebrew 2706 in Strong's Concordance. And this is the one that is translated most often, ordinance. And this is the ordinances of the Passover. Again, it's details, and it's specific details about some aspect of the instructions that Yahweh is giving you. It's a very detailed piece of the broad Torah. But you see how this is all divided up in here. So then in verse 6 we say, then I would not be ashamed when I look into all your commands, mitzvot. Now mitzvot is a word that carries with it some action. This is something that you have to do. This is what most people think of as, well, if you keep the law, then you're legalistic. So this is what comes into mind when people are thinking that the Torah is legalistic. It's these mitzvot. You don't earn anything by them, but there are definitely actions that you have to do. You don't do a mitzvot without actually doing something. And even the Hebrews talk about doing a mitzvah, a good deed. They call it a good deed or a tov deed, because it's something tov that you do. And if it's commanded by Yahweh and you do it, that's tov, right? But that's just a part. You see, that's just a part of Torah. Torah is so much more. In verse 7 then, I thank you with uprightness of heart when I learn the right rulings, the mishpat or the mishpatim, the right rulings of your righteousness. So mishpatim are part of righteousness because they are part of Torah. And this is where you make what we call judgments. When you have to decide, when you have to make choices, you make a judgment. And, you know, we're faced with this every day. Are we going to make the choice to obey Yahweh? Are we going to make the choice to do Yahweh's will, Yahweh's desire, or otherwise? That's a mishpat. When you understand what Yahweh desires, and you have to make a choice of either doing that or doing something else, called sometimes a right ruling or a judgment. In Psalm 119, so that's a very common used term in the Hebrew scriptures, 421 times. Still only like 1/3 of the number that the word Torah or word, that the word word is used to describe Yahweh's word. In Psalm 119, just this psalm, not just these first 7 verses. The first 7 verses contain 7 of the 8 words. The one that it doesn't have is Devarim, which I said it was 1,438 times used in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament. But here in Psalm 119, Torah occurs 25 times in the psalm, the whole psalm, not the first 7 verses, but the whole Psalm 119. Torah occurs 25 times. Testimonies, remember, which is what the manna and the tables of stone were witnesses, occurs 22 times. Ways, the Darryll, occurs 11 times. Precepts occur 21 times. Mitzvot, or commandments, occur 22 times. Right rulings, the judgments, occur 23 times. And statutes occur 21 times. So in all of these verses in Psalm 119, which we read for the 50 days going up to Shavuot, twice, and then when we come up to the 44th day, which is going to be like Tuesday, we're going to start for the 3rd time. These are the number of times these words occur in this psalm alone, just in this psalm. In 1 John 3:4, we read this from one of the disciples of Yahshua. Everyone doing sin also does lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. And in the Hebrew New Testament it would be lo Torah, going against Torah. Now Torah itself, what Torah really means, and I've got that defined up there, is to what you aim at, your goal. Your goal is Torah. That's your goal. And so when you sin, you miss the goal. And that's what the Hebrew word kata for sin is. It means missing the mark, missing the target, missing the point. Because Torah in general is a goal or point that Yahweh is telling us that we need to aim toward. And one of the best ways to think of that is that that goal or that point is the very character of Yahweh as revealed by Genesis 1:26. That really tells us what the goal and the point is of our relationship with Yahweh, is to become just like him. So Torah, Yahshua, by the way, kept the Torah. Yahshua was and is Torah. In fact, we can go back to Genesis 1:1, and we can look at the first word, Barashit, in a beginning was Rashit. Rashit was the beginning. And that's a term for Yahshua. So Yahshua is the first word in the Hebrew Scriptures. He's also the first word in John 1:1, because John 1:1 in the Hebrew text starts out exactly with the same word, not Ba-Rashit, but Bereshit. In a beginning was the Word, Devarim, or Devar. And the Word was with Yahweh, and the Word was, or with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim. And Yahshua is that Word. Yahshua is the Devar of Yahweh. When Moses spoke to the people, and it says the word of Yahweh came to Moshe, and he spoke to the people, the word that he spoke to the people was the word of Yahweh. They weren't the words of Moses. They were the words of Yahweh. Romans chapter 10 and verse 4. This is oh, wait a minute. I don't want to get that far yet. I want to go back to, I skipped something here on page 2 of the notes. This is where I'm talking about the words that Moses heard from Yahweh were the word of Yahweh, and it was the word of Yahweh that he spoke. When we went back to this, and we saw in the beginning was the Word. So what else does Torah reveal? Torah reveals this, for sure, this difference between Ba and Ba, between a beginning and the beginning. And from the same thing, we find this Reshith was Yahshua. What else do we have in Torah? We have these examples that I was going through earlier. We have Moses as being a parallel to Yahshua, don't we? Moses said, Yahweh will raise up a prophet like unto me, him you shall hear. Moses spoke the word of Yahweh, Yahshua was the word of Yahweh. So we have Moses and Yahshua. We have birth, and we have the peril of death. And we see death all the way back in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. With Hawa and Adam, death entered in because of kata, because of missing the goal. We have death, Abel, and then we have this little example, the peril of death. The peril of death. And this is where we might make a connection between that first month of a child and death in the Torah as given in Numbers. Can you see a little bit of a hint there of that? We have Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is a parallel to Herod, is he not? Pharaoh, Israel had to go down into Egypt and then be rescued from it. Herod, Yahshua had to go down to Egypt to escape Herod. And then we could even say Hasatan, a third parallel to Pharaoh, Herod, and Hasatan would be the one that we have to be rescued from in the world. He's the one who is in control. He's the prince of the power of the air, and he is the one who is going to control your human nature unless you get Yahshua's and Yahweh's spirit to kick him out. We have the time of bondage for Israel. We have the condition of man in the flesh. There's a parallel. And Yahweh has to rescue us just the way he rescued Israel from Egypt. We have signs and miracles in the scripture, and there are all kinds of parallels. In Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, we read this: Yahweh your Elohim shall raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brothers. Listen to him. There's Moses and Yahshua. And 34, Deuteronomy 34 and verse 10, and since then no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moshe, whom Yahweh knew face to face. Now, does that make any sense? When Moses spoke that in 1815, not the year, but chapter 18 of Deuteronomy in verse 15, and in chapter 34 of the same book, it says no prophet has arisen. When do you think that was put in there? 1,000 years later than Moses by Ezra. Now, does that make a little more sense? That Ezra would say, for the last 1,000 years, Moses promised a prophet like himself, but for these 1,000 years it hasn't happened yet. And that could have been said all the way up to the birth of the Messiah. Well, actually, not his birth, but in 27 AD. So that verse makes a lot more sense when you realize that Ezra edited the book of Deuteronomy. That's not to say that Yahweh didn't have Ezra insert those things. It's just to say that, hey, Moses did not write every word of Deuteronomy. Okay? So when Moses spoke the word he heard from Yahweh, let me repeat that once again. It was the word of Yahweh that he spoke. John 14:29. So here's Moses, and here's what Yahshua said. John 14:29. Because I spoke not from myself, Yahshua, but the Father who sent me has given me a command, what I should say, what I should speak, the word of Yahweh. And I know that his command is everlasting life. Therefore, whatever I speak, as the Father has said to me, so I speak. So Yahshua said the same thing that Moses could say. Yahweh speaks to me. What Yahweh speaks to me, I say to you, but it isn't my word, it's the word of Yahweh. Because Yahshua, just like Moses, was a prophet, a priest, and an anointed one. A king. He said, well, you said I'm a king, but my kingdom is not from yet. Deuteronomy 33 and 4. Moses commanded us a Torah, a general teaching, a general instruction, because Moses apparently was commissioned by Yahweh to write down the book of Genesis. Moses commanded us a Torah, an inheritance of the assembly of Yaakov, and he was sovereign, king, in Yeshurun. Yeshurun is a term, just a poetic term for Israel. When the heads of the people were gathered, the tribes of Israel. So even the word Torah itself, again, does not simply mean law, which to many means a list of do's and don'ts, and leads many to condemn, to the concept to condemn those keepers of the Torah with the term legalism. It comes from the Hebrew word hora, yara, which means to teach, instruct, or guide, to aim at, or to point to, thus the concept of sin, to miss the mark, or miss what you are aiming at. That's what sin is. So, we have gone through Psalm 119. I'm not necessarily going through these notes in order, but you'll pretty much find that it's all there except except that little diversion about Devar and Devarim. And so, like I said, John said that everyone doing sin also does lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Yahshua kept the Torah. Yahshua was and is the Torah. So hopefully you can see from this discussion here that Torah is so much more than just law. Just law. It's more of a general teaching and instruction. What a great blessing to begin to understand what it is and why we have it. Romans chapter 10 and verse 4. This is another one of the scriptures that is accredited to Shaul when he wrote to the Romans, that shows me that Shaul undoubtedly understood Genesis 1:26. He understood Genesis 1 with what John wrote, or probably at the time that Paul was writing this, what was maybe written down somewhere or heard John quote what he wrote in Genesis or in John 1:1, and that Yahshua was the Word and Yahshua was the Torah. He says in verse 4 of Romans chapter 10, for Messiah is the goal. Now the King James says the end, but end in our language has more than one concept. You know, the end could be the end zone. That's the goal that a football player looks for, isn't it? The end is the goal. And that's what the word, the Greek word telos, by the way, even the Greek word means. It doesn't mean the end, bye-bye. It doesn't mean that kind of an end. It means the goal, the aim. That's what the Torah means. So is Paul also saying that Yahshua is the Torah? He is the Torah. Yes, he is. Unto righteousness, to everyone who doesn't just have a belief in his heart, but who emunah, who actually obeys. And Yahshua said, the ones who are my brothers, my sisters, who are my mother, they are the ones who do the desire of my Father. Now, you know lots of people probably, especially, some of those who have attended Messianic groups, they know lots of people who claim to keep the Torah. But I maintain if they're mixing, they're not keeping the Torah. Either because they haven't come yet to understand what the Torah is, or they simply don't want to leave their past life behind. Right? And like we have said so many times, what you have to do when you come to Yahweh is you have to burn down the house. You don't leave the old house back there so you can creep back to it every now and then, whenever you want to get comfortable. You burn the house down when you make a commitment to Yahweh. And that's what true Torah keeping is. So hopefully you can understand a little bit better that, be careful when you say, well, they're Torah keepers. Well, are they really Torah keepers? If they're mixing, they are not. May Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and give you his favor. May Yahweh lift up his countenance over you and give you his peace. Eva rekeka Yahweh vayishmereka. Ya'er Yahweh panavaleka vikaneka. Yasa Yahweh panavaleka v'yasem laka shalom.